Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the brutal capitalist dictatorship of Kuala Lumpur. I hope you're having an amazing day, because if you're having an amazing day, I'm having an amazing day. And if I'm having an amazing day, you should also be having an amazing day. So let's get cracking with today's video. Now, you may or may not have heard of this American TV series known as Futurama. Now, for the record, I just want to clarify that most of what comes out of America, in my humble opinion, is garbage. Yes, most of what comes out of America is overrated garbage, quite frankly. But every now and then, just occasionally, the Americans will produce an outstanding, moderately acceptable piece of literature or media content that's, relatively unforgettable, and Futurama is an example of one such piece of literature. Yes, it's a very good TV series. You should check it out, I hate most of what comes out of America. In fact, I hate America with every fiber of my being, but I must admit, to be fair, that every now and then America produces some, borderline acceptable things. But anyway, Futurama is basically about this young man named Fry who gets cryogenically frozen and reawakened 1,000 years later, right? And this young man's got to make a life for himself in the future, basically, right? And there's one scene in Futurama which involves a bunch of millionaires, or billionaires, I think. And basically Fry is going like, woohoo! Because Fry is a 20th century American, right? He's cheering for the millionaires and the billionaires, because you know how America is. They treat the wealthy as if they're celebrities, If you are rich, you are a dragon. But if you're poor, you are a worm. That's how you are in America, basically. So Fry, as usual, does his usual rich worship, typically American thing of rich worshipping. And Leela, his girlfriend, asks him, why are you cheering, Fry? You're not rich. And Fry replies, he says, I may not be rich today, but someday, in the future, I will be rich. And then people like me had better watch out. The American writer John Steinbeck once said, and I quote, socialism never really took off in America because most Americans don't see themselves as oppressed proletariat, right? But rather as temporarily embarrassed millionaires, right? So if we're going to link that back to the scene in Futurama, Fry may be an oppressed proletariat delivery man, but even he does not look upon himself in that way, because Fry has been brainwashed into buying into the so-called American dream. The idea that with enough grit, with enough hard work, everyone can eventually become a millionaire, right? So Fry is what you'd call the temporarily embarrassed millionaire, right? And Karl Marx once said that religion is the opium of the masses, because religion gives poor, downtrodden, and down on their luck people a means by which they may cope with the harsh realities of the world. But I would argue that if religion is the opium of the masses, then the American dream is the Bourbon of the American masses. For it is the American dream that intoxicates even poor, downtrodden Americans into delusions of grandeur, into believing that someday they too shall join the ruling class and graduate from oppressed to oppressor someday. And this American dream is instilled in the mind of every single American from day one. You can go back to my last video on rugged individualism. Yes. Another idea in American society, I think, is individualism. And that idea is also instilled in every American since day one. So naturally, you would find many Americans believing that collectivism is in fact a tyrannical system. Yes, I may call Kuala Lumpur, the city in which I reside, a brutal capitalist dictatorship. I mean, look around you. Look at all the vile, grotesque symbols of capitalism all around you. But at the very same time, I am fully aware of the fact that we, as the Americans would say, to use American slang, we ain't got shit on America, so to speak, right? If we are a brutal capitalist dictatorship, then America must be a brutal capitalist empire. And that is why capitalist reaction is bad all around the world, but it's particularly bad in America, because America is basically laissez-faire on steroids. Because you see, it's easy, or relatively easier, to revolutionize the downtrodden classes in Malaysia or any other country that's not America. But one unique thing about America that sets itself apart from the rest of the world, and I don't mean any disrespect to the poor people of America, but one unique thing about your country is that if you try to push for socialism in America, you have people not only from the ruling class, but also from the most downtrodden sectors of society who are actually against it, right? Now, in Malaysia, right, you will find that the people who are generally sympathetic to socialism tend to be people from ethnic minority backgrounds who are economically disenfranchised, right? But in America, even ethnic minorities that are disenfranchised, when you put forward the idea of socialism to them, well, they may take it as an insult. Why? Because they may think that you think that they're not good enough to thrive under capitalism. And as John Steinbeck said, many Americans, even poor ones, regard themselves not as oppressed proletariat, but rather as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. So, that's why the soil for socialism, a socialist revolution in America, is simply not fertile, because people have been so brainwashed into believing that someday, with enough hard work, with enough grit, and with enough perseverance, they too will be rich. But it's a lie. It doesn't work that way, simply put, because, capitalism is a zero-sum game. For somebody to gain, for somebody to get richer, somebody has to be poorer as a result, right? You think that countries like the Nordic social democratic countries in the Scandinavian world are rich and comfortable at no one's expense? Hello? I live in the global south, and I can tell you that somebody is footing the bill for these social democratic countries in order to uphold their standard of living, right? The 1950s, the era that these bootstrapped boomers love to reminisce about, was rather the exception rather than the norm. Yes, you see, throughout most of history, America has not been a wealthy country, right? Most Americans have not enjoyed the same standard of living that people in America did, as long as they were white and Christian and male, in the 1950s, right? And these bootstraps boomers, as well as right-wing Americans, love to look back at this era and say, why can't we be like that again? Why can't this young generation just pick itself up by its bootstraps just like we did, right? And basically, why is it everyone is so lazy and so, they spend too much money these days? Why can't Americans be like they were in the 50s, right? And you have these bootstraps boomers even saying shit like, back in my day, in the 1950s, my parents could send me to university with just one paycheck. So I don't see why you need any handouts, mister. Right? Because basically, it's all a matter of personal responsibility. If your parents are responsible, they too will save up for your college education, and that's not my job to pay for it, right? But the fact of the matter is that the 50s were really an exception rather than the rule. In America in the 50s, as I've said, if you were white and male and Christian, your standard of living was probably vastly better than the vast majority of the world, right? And the 50s experienced an economic boom because America was the victor, or rather America emerged the victor of the Second World War, right? So many Western historians regard the Second World War, the end of the Second World War, as basically the end of history, so to speak. Basically the idea that liberal Western democracy, like America, for example, will be the de facto system in the so-called civilized world. And basically, at the end of World War II, the world was basically split into two different sides, East and West, right? The barbarous communist East and the civilized, rules-based, democratic, capitalist West, so to speak, right? But the Americans had no idea that good times were never going to last, because whenever there's a rise, there's always going to be a fall, right? Right? Because you know how late-stage capitalism works. But anyway, America, by this point, is suffering from the Great Recession 2.0, right? But the fact is that the American neoliberals, as well as the average America First fellow, simply has too much hubris in order to admit that there is something fundamentally wrong with the capitalist system of America, right? That can only get rich on the backs of other countries, namely countries in the less developed, uncivilized world, right? Instead, they choose to blame it on personal responsibility and say that, oh, America has got a loss of cultural values, as if they had any cultural values in the first place, right? America, of course, could never, ever sustain that 50s standard of living, simply because America could not keep its hands out of wars. America has never, ever encountered a war that it didn't like, you see. So, as a result of, the Vietnam War, the Iraq War, and the endless streams of donations that they give to their pet project in the Middle East known as Israel, the proxy state of Israel, who, by the way, have got universal health care already, while the Americans don't have it. America soon ended up going into decline, and we are now seeing the effects of this decline, right? But of course, the neoliberals and even the average America First civilian have got way too much hubris. They've simply got too much hubris to admit that there's something fundamentally wrong with the way America manages itself, and instead they're choosing to blame individuals. They're choosing to blame this current generation for their lack of personal responsibility, chronic laziness, and lack of accountability for their own bad choices, right? When in reality, the current miserable state of America is really a product of its leaders' own bad choices. The America of the 1950s was not only an anomaly, but also, like the social democratic Nordic countries, in order for people to enjoy that white picket fence lifestyle, somebody in the global south had to be footing that bill, right? So that sort of lifestyle is only sustainable, as a result of wars, imperialism, and conquest. But without wars, imperialism, and conquest, right, when America is unable to constantly sustain itself militarily, right, due to the fact that it has exhausted its coffers, you will find that that it is not going to be the prosperous, opulent jewel of the Pacific quite much longer, right? And what you see in basically downtown New York, basically in the ghettos of New York, are really going to be the norm rather than the exception of America, right? Unless, of course, it drastically changes its way of doing things. Like try a little thing known as socialism, although frankly, most Americans are too frightened of that word to even consider entertaining the prospect. But the fact is that your capitalist overlords, despite gaslighting you with this big dream of becoming a millionaire someday, do not actually want you to be a millionaire. Now, they might gaslight you with that dream in order to make you keep working, but the reality is that if you were to become rich, then whose value would they appropriate, right? So, of course, they tell you that you're not rich because you're not working hard enough, right? Even though you may be working 2 to 3 jobs, at minimum wage, right? They tell you that you're not rich because you don't have the intelligence or the grit in order to become rich, right? But the reality is, like the promise of heaven after death, this promise of becoming a millionaire is also a carrot on a stick by which the capitalist reactionaries keep you hooked and keep you working hard, keeping your nose to the grindstone, so to speak, right? To quote a part from John Steinbeck's book of Mice and Men, nobody gets any land in the end. The fact of the matter is that hard work does not make you rich, right? If hard work did in fact make you rich, then every sweatshop worker in Bangladesh or other parts of the global south would be a millionaire, right? No, it is not hard work that makes you rich. Under the capitalist system in which we live, it is the appropriation of value that makes a person rich. Ergo, in order for Armani to sell his shirts for $500 each, he has to pay his workers, I don't know, $5 a day, right? So do you see how our money basically appropriates the value of the people in the global south, right? Do you see how someone like Giorgio Armani or any other capitalist dictator ends up driving fancy Porsches or BMWs or sailing in private yachts, while people in their sweatshops don't even have a proper roof over their heads, right? In order for somebody like a capitalist dictator to enjoy the standard of living that they currently enjoy, somebody in a poorer country has got to pay for it, right? The American president, Joe Biden, once said that China shall never become number one. Not on my watch. Do you know why he said it? No, it's not because he hates Chinese people. No, it is because, without China being poor and downtrodden, simply put, who would produce his cheap products? Where would he find sweatshops to get cheap, affordable products, right? And whose labor would his American capitalists appropriate if there were no more sweatshops left in China, right? But in societies that have caught the capitalist mind virus and bought into this so-called American dream, not just America, but other capitalist societies as well, like Singapore or South Korea or industrial Japan. We're not talking about the rural areas of Japan, yeah? We're talking about places like Tokyo, for example. Many people literally kill themselves working tirelessly in order to attain this unattainable standard, basically, for most people, right? Right? They sacrifice time that could be spent with family, that could be spent with friends, in order to sacrifice themselves to the altar of a corporation that does not give a damn whether they live or die, right? People have been so brainwashed by the cult of capital that they have forgotten their own humanity. They have been alienated from their own humanity. And they consider poverty to be such a form of dishonor, right? They consider it such a form of dishonor to regard themselves as oppressed victims, because they have been gaslighted into believing that they are disgraceful if they think of themselves as oppressed proletariat, that they would rather be homeless than advocate for a system which will provide their material needs, or rather which will take care of the material needs of not just a few, not just a select class, but of all men and women in a society, and children. Rather than advocate for such a system, they would rather be homeless and starving, right? That is what I mean by the capitalist mind virus, right? Basically, shooting yourself in the foot, right? Drinking poison, expecting it to be tonic, right? And even more outlandish is that you will hear some exploited working class Americans, even watching this video, who will say to me, or not just Americans, other nationalities as well, they'll say to me, look, you're only a socialist because you're poor and broke, but if you were rich, you would be a capitalist as well. You would be a reactionary if you were rich. Well, the fact of the matter is that I've never wanted for money. I'm upper middle class. I was brought up in an upper middle class family, and although I don't look it, I do have a decent paying job as an English teacher, right? Yes, I'm an English teacher and I'm a happy chappy, you know. I might be disgusted by the rapacious, exploitative system of capitalism, but overall I'm a happy person because happy is the man whose passion coincides with his profession, right? But the fact of the matter is that this idea that communism was invented by a bunch of resentful, broke losers, right? This idea that the reactionaries like Jordan Peterson will push on you is really a straw man of what communism or socialism really are, right? Because these reactionaries, these capitalist reactionaries like Peterson, are not seeing it through the lens of pragmatism, but idealism. The American dream itself is a form of idealism that people have been brainwashed into believing. And if you think Marxism is an idealistic philosophy, you have no idea what it really is, right? It's not a matter of the poor hating the rich, right? Yes, it is easier to revolutionize poor people, right? But poor people generally do not hate the rich, contrary to what these reactionaries want to tell you. It is the rich who hate the poor in a capitalist system, right? It is the fact that they would think that communism or socialism was a matter of, you know, basically the poor seizing the money and personal property of the rich, as opposed to a reshuffling of the entire system. I'm not a communist, by the way, but I'm a Confucian socialist, but I do know communism is not idealistic. The fact of the matter is that basically it tells you the fact that they think that the poor resent the rich tells you all you need to know about these capitalist reactionaries, right? The fact of the matter is that, no, even when I say that capitalism is not working, I don't say it from the lens of a vulgar idealist, right? I don't think rich people essentially are necessarily immoral as long as they attained their wealth honorably, right? Say, for example, you are a singer or a movie star, right? Or a model, and you know, you're not exploiting anyone, you don't own a factory, and you're not underpaying and overworking anyone, but you got rich from your modeling work or your movie star work or your singing career. That's not the problem. Those are not the people that socialists go after. It is the people who hold on to the means of production, who can influence the lives of other people, that people like the socialists are concerned about, right? The capitalist class, right? Now, the fact of the matter is that, you know, basically, the reason why the American dream, or this idea that, you know, you will be rich with enough hard work and determination, is absurd, is simply because, yes, some people, a very small number of people, have indeed clawed themselves out of poverty, right? Yeah. But that's the exception rather than the norm, right? Yeah, some people from the ghetto can indeed claw themselves out of poverty, but studies have shown, objective studies have shown, and I'll link them in my description box, that if you were brought up in a ghetto, your chances of clawing yourself out of poverty are much lower than somebody who was born into an upper middle class environment. Not hating on that person, by the way, I'm just saying, like myself, is ever to fall into poverty, right? I repeat, if you were born in a ghetto, your chances of clawing yourself out of poverty are much lower than the chances of someone who was brought up in an upper middle class echelon is to fall into poverty, right? Not that I want them to fall into poverty, but I'm saying why not eradicate ghettos in the first place? Not destroy them, but sublate them, or basically make them superfluous. And how do we do that? Well, you're not going to do that under capitalism, because in order for people to exist, for people to enjoy copious amounts of wealth, like on a global scale, you can say Armani, for example, is very rich because his sweatshop workers are very poor, right? The same applies on a microcosmic scale in one country. For a class of men like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk to exist, there must always be ghettos in order to provide sustenance for their existence, right? For their capital. Karl Marx once said that labor has created beautiful things. It has created palaces for the rich and hovels for the poor, right? So you see what we're getting at, right? Okay, let me put it another way. Like, if you're a famous, the American dream would have you believe, right, that everyone can become a millionaire, or everyone can enjoy a comfortable standard of living under laissez-faire capitalism. You know, if only they pick themselves up by their bootstraps and stop whining, right? But the fact is that by that same logic, right, everyone can become a movie star, or everyone can become an athlete, right? Yeah, just because a few people have defied the odds and become movie stars and athletes doesn't mean that everyone can become a movie star or athlete, you know, just by the sweat of their brow. So the same logic applies. Yes, some people from, you know, impoverished backgrounds have indeed joined the capitalist class, but they are an anomaly, right? They are the exception rather than the norm, right? Just like, yes, some people end up becoming movie stars or sports stars, but what is the percentage of these people in any given society, right? So it's ludicrous to think that everyone can become a capitalist, because when you become a capitalist, you have to exploit in order to maintain your position, right? There's no other way that you can enjoy your standard of living, your standard of living without exploitation, right? Under the current economic state of capitalism. So if everybody became a capitalist, well, there would be no more proletariat left. And who would produce the surplus value that goes into the mansions or yachts or fancy cars of these, these capitalist overlords, right? So just to wrap this video up, I'm not saying that it's a bad thing to work hard, right? I'm not saying that we should lie on our backs and not do anything all day, but let's stop pretending that poor and downtrodden people are lazy. Poor, downtrodden people in any given society are, for the most part, some of the most hard-working, industrious people on the face of God's green earth, right? But they have been brainwashed into believing that they're not good enough by a group of nefarious individuals who basically dangle the prospect of becoming part of the ruling class, but have no intention of ever letting them into the ruling class themselves, right? The fact is that, the fact is that socialism is not some kind of Robin Hood adventurism of robbing the rich and giving the spoils to the poor. Now, Robin Hood wasn't even a communist, technically speaking, because, well, you see, he lived in feudal times and he wasn't advocating for the peasants to take over the farms. Now, that might make him a communist. No, Robin Hood was not what you would describe as a socialist or a communist, right? That's not what socialism really is. Socialism or communism is basically a reshuffling of the system in order to give the producers of value the right to own their own labor, to reap the fruits of their own labor. It is not a matter of sitting down and doing nothing and receiving handouts, but a matter of ensuring that every single person will be paid fairly the value of his or her labor. In fact, he or she will not even be paid, because he or she will be reaping the fruits of his or her own labor. And the capitalist overlords, well, what's going to happen to them is, after being re-educated, they too will work a dignified job for their own keep, right? They will earn their own keep, and they will not depend on the labor of another person, right, to get it, right? So that's all I have to say today, and that's basically it. Thank you very much, and have a lovely day. Bangunlah rakyat yang tertindas, bangun rakyat yang diperas. Nyalakan api perjuangan, menjulang kebenaran. Hancurkan segala penindasan, ayo kita bangun, bangun. Dunia baru kita dirikan pasti jadi kenyataan. Perjuangan penghabisan bersatu kita lawan, dan internasional pastikan berjaya. Perjuangan penghabisan bersatu kita lawan, dan internasional pastikan berjaya.